the reasons for the importance of this story, there are at least the following three. First, Roman oppression meant that many Galileans, knew hunger firsthand. So at its simplest, this is a story about God providing enough bread for hungry people. Second are the Exodus echoes throughout this story. Jesus provides bread in the wilderness as an evil ruler, this time Herod Antipas. In the Exodus story, of course, it's Pharaoh. But an evil ruler lurks and threatens in the background. After the miracle, Jesus will go up on the mountain to pray, as Moses did. And then there will be a miraculous sea crossing. We've seen before how Mark, in his storytelling, evokes the God of the Exodus, the one who heard the cries of the slaves down in Egypt and set them free. He provided them manna in the wilderness. You will remember that part of the story, perhaps. And Mark presents this God as the one who is present to God's people in Jesus. And then third, the story encourages followers to see that when they receive the bread, which Jesus blesses and shares with them, when they receive it and then share it with each other, there is more than enough for everyone. The compassion and generosity born of trust in the God of the Exodus means that followers of Jesus are able to care for one another so that they survive and maybe even thrive in the midst of Roman oppression. Now, before we move to the other stories, I want to note the conversation between Jesus and the disciples in this story. If you'd like to follow along, I'm going to be reading from chapter 6, verse 35. So, Jesus has been teaching them. And when it grew late, his disciples came to Jesus and said, "This is a deserted place." Literally, this is a wilderness. And the hour is now very late. "Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy something for themselves to eat." But Jesus answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Are we to go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" And then, of course, you know what comes next. Jesus ends up feeding them with 5 loaves and 2 fish. What I want us to pay attention to is this conversation with the disciples for just a minute. Last week, at the end of our time together, I was asked a question about the disciples, about their abrupt following of Jesus, how that might have come about, what do we know about them, and how that happened. As the questioner noted, Mark doesn't actually tell us anything about any of that, except that Jesus called and they followed immediately. So the truth is we have to make some educated guesses, but we can. I want us to start with seeing them as real human beings. And what I mean by that is not as superheroes of faith, which we often, at least in my experience in church, we often view them that way. You got to remember that Mark and members of his audience may well have known some of these people. And so they knew them as real human beings. And so Mark is telling their story, and we should expect, as he does, that their responses to Jesus are also quite human, as we see in this story. When Jesus tells them to feed the crowd, they are clueless, as I might suspect you and I would be. Quite honestly, I used to make fun of the disciples' response, but I don't anymore. I've come to appreciate them as human beings. And at this point in the story, they can't know how things will play out. They're trying to make sense of things as we go. So with that comment, let me say this about the question from last week. My guess, because we're making educated guesses here, my guess is that the day that Jesus walked up to Peter and Andrew and said, "Follow me," was not their first encounter with Jesus, though Mark doesn't tell us that there were previous encounters. I would just guess that there had been lots of conversations between Jesus and lots of people. See, I would guess that Jesus, again, who Mark presents himself as a real human being, also the Son of God, but very real in his humanness, that Jesus also had to process this. What is this thing that God is calling me to do? How do I do this? How does this play out? I would guess there was lots of conversation, processing between Jesus and a lot of different folks. And then one day, he has a sense that it's time. And so he walks up to Peter and Andrew and says, essentially, let's do this. And they do, which is kind of amazing. But they don't stop being real human beings now as they go along. And we're about to see that of them as we take a look at them going forward. So my best guess is about the question that we were asked last week. And again, a reminder, let's keep seeing them as very real human beings as we go. Okay? All right, now, let's go to chapter 7, verse 1. Here is the second bread story in this series. Verse 1. Now, when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who'd come from Jerusalem gathered around him, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating bread with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. These religious leaders are about to try to use what they've witnessed here to try to dishonor Jesus. Remember, this is a shame-honor culture. And they're going to try to dishonor Jesus before the people by pointing out that his disciples are eating bread with unclean hands. Now, your translation may not have bread in it. Most of them don't. But it's there in the Greek. It should be there in the English because that ties this story to what comes before and what comes after. What they ask about is this whole washing of hands. Ritual purity practices were not about germs, and they weren't about stopping coronavirus. We all know about washing our hands these days, right? But in this context, these were practices that set apart those who observed them as clean and holy before God. And by the way, those words are synonyms. Clean and holy are synonyms. And it means literally to be set apart for God. These practices separated Jews from Gentiles. That's probably pretty obvious. But it also separated Jews from one another because some Jews were not able to keep those ritual purity practices. Their occupations, their daily lives wouldn't allow it. You know, if you're a farmer out in the field, if you're a fisherman out in a boat, you can't do the kinds of ritual purity practices that were encouraged by these religious leaders. And so these rules had become one more way that people were segregated from one another and where some could claim to be more holy than other people. In this story, the religious leaders try to use those purity rules to put Jesus on the unholy side of the divide. Skip down now to verse 14. Let me clear my throat. Skip down now to verse 14. Let's read. Jesus called the crowd. This is after some conversation with them about his disciples eating with bread with unwashed hands. And Jesus called the crowd and said to them, listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside the person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. And when he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about the parable. Notice they call his teaching a parable, even though it wasn't a story. Any of his teaching that sort of make them go, what did he say? And Mark is a parable. So they asked him about the parable. And Jesus said to them, do you also fail to understand? Don't you see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile, since it enters not the heart, but the stomach, and goes out into the sewer. Thus he declared all foods clean. And Jesus said, it's what comes out of a person that defiles. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come. So Jesus counters their charge with an entirely different understanding of purity. It's a matter of one's heart and not anything that's outside a person. Consider the implications of what he's just said. If purity comes from one's heart, then a leper or a tax collector could be more pure than a priest. A Gentile could be more pure than a Jew. A woman more pure or holy than a man. Jesus' teaching is so opposite everything they've been taught that Jesus' disciples really struggle right here to see. It's not the first time, and it's not going to be the last. From there, Jesus travels, not surprisingly, given what he's just said, to Gentile territory, where he has an encounter with a Syro-Phoenician woman, and just a fabulous story that time constraints won't allow us to dwell. But let me just note a couple of things about that story, again, to appreciate it in terms of the cycle of stories. From a first century Jewish perspective, this woman was as unclean as one could be. A Gentile and a woman. She behaves inappropriately by approaching Jesus. She is sexually suspect. A whole bunch of reasons for that. Just, if you will, just trust me on that. So her sexual behavior is suspect. And she has a daughter who is possessed by an unclean spirit. Jesus at first actually refuses to share the children's bread with her. And she argues with him. And she wins the argument. And Jesus ends up healing her daughter. And I think that she helps him. Remember again, Mark portrays him as human, and humans grow and learn. And she helps him see just how wide and how full God's inclusion, God's welcome is. It extends even to someone like her. So finally, we come to chapter 8, verse 1, skipping a couple of stories, obviously, but we're getting to the bread stories. In chapter 8, verse 1, we find a second feeding the multitude story. I wonder if you even knew there were two. It is so much like the first one. Jesus' compassion, the disciples' cluelessness, bread in the wilderness, there's more than enough that we could wonder why Mark bothered to include it if we don't understand the geography. The Sea of Galilee formed part of the boundary between Jewish and non-Jewish territories. The first feeding story happened on the Gentile side of the Sea of Galilee. The second story the first story happened on the Jewish side of the Sea of Galilee. And the second story, the one here in chapter 8, happens on the Gentile side of the sea. So from the first feeding story to the second story, Mark shows us Jesus crossing the boundaries that were dividing people from one another until we see that the Jewish Messiah is sharing bread on both shores of the Sea of Galilee. Some of you may remember that I've pointed out that one of the great promises of God's renewal in the kingdom of God is God's peace, which does not come from conquering enemies, but from turning enemies into friends. The wolf does not kill the lamb. They lie down together. That's one of the beautiful promises that we will likely remember from Isaiah. And so Mark shows us Jesus living into this promise as he erases the divisions among the people, has compassion on Jew and Gentile alike, and shares bread with everyone, including the Syrophoenician woman. The God of the Exodus through Jesus is setting people free again, is liberating people from the enslaving forces of division, fear, suspicion, and hunger. So those are the bread stories. I think they're marvelous stories, and Mark's storytelling just really shines. And it takes us then to the end of the part of Mark that recounts Jesus' mission in Galilee. By this point, the disciples now have been with Jesus quite a bit. They're listening to him. They're watching what he does. Many of them likely came and went, by the way. They do have families at home. They are real human beings. But even as they come and go, they've had a chance to be with Jesus quite a bit and listen to what he says and see what he does. I want you to look with me in chapter 8, verse 14. Well, I'll turn the page. So what's happened at verse 14 is that Jesus and disciples have gotten into the boat to cross the Sea of Galilee back to the Jewish side after the feeding story. And verse 14 tells us that the disciples had forgotten to bring any bread, and they only had one loaf with them in the boat. And Jesus cautioned them, saying, watch out. The Greek word is see. Beware the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. Yeast had apparently become by this time quite the metaphor for evil in the world. Apparently because, it only takes a little bit to infect, if you will, a whole batch. All right. So Jesus tells them to beware the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod. And the disciples said to one another, it's because we have no bread. Becoming aware of it, Jesus said to them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? They said to him, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000? How many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? And they said to him, 7. And then he said to them, don't you yet understand? As we might say in our time, this is not a good look for the disciples, right? Despite their time with Jesus, including twice witnessing him feeding multitudes, when he tells them to see the yeast of the power brokers in their world, all they can see is what is right in front of their physical eyes. They only have one loaf of bread with them in the boat. So Jesus reminds them of the feeding, events that they had actually been a part of as a way of saying, look, guys, one loaf is not my concern here. And he asked them, having eyes do you fail to see? Having ears do you fail to hear? And do you notice they don't answer those questions? Unfortunately, they don't have to. Now, I've noted before that if Mark were like a modern historian, if Mark thought like a modern historian, he would look for what actually happened next and record it. But that's not how Mark thinks. He doesn't think like a modern historian. So what he chooses to narrate next is more about his message for his people than trying to create a historically perfect record. We shouldn't be surprised then that Mark's story, after the disciples' failure to see in the boat, is about a blind guy. Look with me, chapter 8, beginning in verse 22. So they came to Bethsaida. They've crossed the sea now back onto Jewish shores. They came to Bethsaida. Some people brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had put saliva on his eyes and laid his hands on him, Jesus asked him, can you see anything? And the man looked up and said, I can see people, but they look like trees walking. Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and the man looked intently, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. What is surprising in this story in terms of Jesus' miracles is that Jesus has to touch the man twice before he sees clearly. But what this tells us is what a great storyteller Mark is. So notice Jesus' question to the man after first touching him. Can you see anything? And the man could. He just couldn't see well. And so Jesus touches him a second time. And this time, Mark tells us, the English says he looked intently and his sight was restored, but the Greek is really wonderful. A literal translation would be, he saw through and he saw in. Or he saw clearly and he saw deeply. That's pretty wonderful. So can you tell now why Mark put this story here? Jesus' disciples can see something in Jesus for sure, but they can't see clearly or deeply. They need a second touch, and they're about to get it. Immediately after this story, then, Mark's story shifts. Look at 8:27. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. Real quickly, at 9:30 says they went on from there and passed through Galilee. And if we kept checking markers, what we'd find is that Jesus and his disciples began far in the north at the area of Caesarea Philippi. And they're going to begin a steady journey now that's going to take them through Galilee, beyond the Jordan River, into Judea, and finally to Jerusalem. This is the section of Mark that we usually refer to as the journey to Jerusalem. And on the way, Jesus is going to work to give his disciples a second touch. By the way, here's a heads up. The journey to Jerusalem is going to end with another blind guy story. You think that was an accident? Of course not. Okay, let's go back to verse 27 in chapter 8. So they're passing through Caesarea Philippi, and on the way, Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" Way back when we read the prologue, and we talked about preparing the way of the Lord, I said this is going to end up being a real key theme in Mark, and we're there now. Okay, so on the way, Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." And he asked them, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." Your translation may say, "You are the Christ." That Messiah is Hebrew, Christ is Greek. Same word. Same idea. So Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And Jesus sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Peter's answer, "You are the Messiah," or "You are the Christ," corresponds to the first sentence in Mark's gospel, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus the Christ, the Son of God. So Peter's answer is correct, and if we are attentive readers, we know it's correct, and yet Jesus rebukes him for saying it. It's much stronger in Greek than sternly ordered. It's more like Jesus said, "Don't say that." So what's up? Look in verse 31, but before we do, a little background, a little context. Messiah for us has become a title for Jesus, and we give it a capital M. But in the first century, Messiah could have a lowercase m and be applied to anyone that people thought were anointed by God to accomplish a task. That's actually what the word means. In the past, it had been used for people who helped rebuild Israel after their exile in Babylon. It had been used of the Maccabees when they drove the Syrians out of Israel in the 2nd century BC. In the 1st century, it was apparently being used for a number of people who gathered followers and hoped to drive Rome out of Israel. And that may be what Peter had in mind and why Jesus reacted so sharply. Okay? So, verse 31, after Jesus' sharp remark, he said to them, he began to teach them that the Son of Man, notice he doesn't use Messiah, he switches, that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed. And after 3 days, rise again. He said all this quite openly. For the first time now, Jesus lays out what's coming. And notice that he says it plainly, said it quite openly. No parables now. Simple language quite openly, as he does. And he switches from Messiah to Son of Man, maybe to get away from that term for just a moment. And he announces that the way that they are going will lead to his death. His first announcement of this in Mark. Now, we tend to bring 2,000 years of theologizing about Jesus' death to our reading. And we assume automatically that Jesus died for our sins. But Mark didn't have access to our theologizing. And he actually never uses that phrase, Jesus died for our sins. For him, in the context of the 1st century, Jesus' death was an awful historical reality that he and his audience had to make sense of in the context of their world. So we need to let Mark tell us his understanding of Jesus' death and not read our theologizing into Mark. A first key then to understanding Mark's effort to make sense of Jesus' death lies in the word that is translated as must. The Son of Man must suffer. We have often read it to mean that God sent Jesus to die, but that is not a claim that Mark ever makes. The Greek word literally means it is necessary, and very close to it, it is inevitable. So let's unpack these understandings just a moment. Inevitability seems pretty clear to me. If Jesus continues on the way he's traveling, which challenges Roman order in so many ways, and he will, then his death at their hands is inevitable. The leadership, you may remember, has been plotting his death since chapter 3, verse 6. But how might Mark have understood Jesus' death as necessary? When I work with this text in my classes at MTS, I often ask my students if the suffering of civil rights activists was necessary. And they always answer yes. Segregationists had insisted that segregation was simply a benign system for keeping the peace. You know, we're just keeping people with their own kind, and that helps keep the peace. But when African Americans were arrested, beaten, and killed even for such things as registering to vote or ordering a sandwich at a Woolworth's lunch counter or where they rode on a bus, the lie about segregation as a benign system for keeping the peace was exposed. I've been talking through our study about Roman imaginations, seeing the world the way Rome wanted you to, and that Israel's leadership had such imaginations and sought to reinforce those among their own people. The way Rome ordered the world was just the way things are, they insisted. And they claimed to speak for God when they told Israelites to cooperate and to go along to get along. In reality, they were protecting their place and their power in Israel. Jesus will go to Jerusalem and expose who they are really serving. And he's going to die as a result. So perhaps we should understand Jesus' death as necessary in this sense, in terms of what it exposes. This is a start toward grasping Mark's understanding of Jesus' death. Let me just add here that New Testament writers actually have multiple ways of understanding Jesus' death. So there's not a right way or other ways are wrong. New Testament writers, again, living with this awful reality in their world, made theological sense of Jesus' death in several very powerful ways. Okay? So just let me add that here as we go. All right? So with that announcement and Jesus saying it quite plainly, what happens next? Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him. The same word as earlier when Jesus rebuked Peter. Now, this response suggests that Peter indeed had met Messiah earlier in the sense of someone who inflicted suffering on their enemies, not someone who receives suffering at their hands. Peter wants none of that. And assuming that we're right about Peter, that this is what was in his mind when he used the term Messiah, if that's correct, then Peter is actually operating in the same way as Rome. There's us and them. We need to win and drive them out so that we can rule, not them. We might say that Peter is actually playing the same game that the Romans are playing. He just wants us to win instead of them. Look at Jesus' response now to Peter. But turning and looking at his disciples, Jesus rebuked Peter. Boy, there's a lot of rebuking in this section, right? Jesus rebuked Peter and said to him, "Get behind me, Satan." To Peter, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." The Greek verb here that's translated as setting your mind is really close to what I've intended by using the word imagination. It's more the orientation of your whole being than just the exercise of your mental capacities. So Peter appears to have what I'm calling a Roman imagination. And look at how Jesus describes that orientation. When Peter rejects Jesus' way, Peter is imagining the world like Satan rather than like God. Just let that sink in. Two other times, whoops, I got ahead of myself. Before I do that, I was going to say two other times Jesus is going to announce his death. But before we get there, let's look at Jesus' continued teaching. Look at verse 34. So after this dialogue with the disciples, then Jesus called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it." So now Jesus broadens. Everybody come here. I've got something important to say. And in response, Jesus describes then, in response to what Peter has said, Jesus now describes what truly following him means. First, it requires followers to deny self, which is not to say I am worthless. Instead, it is a call to let go of things like self-gain, self-promotion, self-comfort, what today we would call ego-driven concerns. After all, the religious leaders' desire for these things meant that Rome could buy their cooperation, and then Rome owned them. But to let go of those desires means to be free to follow the way of Jesus. The second part of truly following Jesus means that we take up our cross, which does not mean enduring difficulties without complaining, as in that's just a cross you have to bear. That's not close to what Jesus is saying here. In Mark's first century context, cross had one connotation. It was what Rome did to people who failed or who refused to cooperate with its rules. So Jesus' call to take up the cross then is a call to accept the risks of living in God's kingdom and actively resisting evil in the world. Now, how is anyone ever able to say yes to a call like that? Jesus' answer is, whoever loses their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. The Greek verb that is translated save can also mean heal or make whole. So not just save in the sense, again, that we often use that term to mean after we die, but in the sense of healing your life, making you whole, and that involves now. The Bible, Mark included, is consistent in saying that God is the God of life with a capital L. Not just your heart beating, but life that is creative as God is created, that is meaningful and purposeful and hopeful, life that is gracious and even joyous, even when Rome is Rome. And since God is the author of this life, nobody can take it from you. Rome can stop your heart from beating, but Rome cannot take your life from you when your life is wrapped up in God's life. So let's take a moment now and compare Jesus to the religious leaders that we've seen thus far. Remember, he is a Galilean peasant without wealth or weapons or connections to any power brokers, while they have all of these things. But the religious leaders are so afraid of him that they are following him around, noticing who he's having dinner with, checking out his disciples' hand-washing techniques, and hoping that he will heal a man on the Sabbath so they will have a reason to kill him. And what is he doing while they're doing those things? He is healing people, forgiving them, welcoming them into his community, and sharing festive meals with him. Think about that last point for a moment. These are poor people, but every time Jesus is around, there seems to be a dinner party breaking out. People join together and share meals with one another whenever he is around. So, whose life would you prefer to share, theirs or his? But Jesus is also clear that very life will lead to his death. Rome will stop his heart from beating, and there's no sugarcoating that. Look now at 9:1. Awful chapter break. Awful chapter break, because 9:1 is the conclusion to this teaching of Jesus, not the beginning of a new section in Mark. So chapter 9, verse 1. And Jesus said to them, truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see that the kingdom of God has come with power. To appreciate what Mark is saying, let's remember again what Jesus has meant by seeing. And let's note again that the Greek verb for has come is perfect tense, not future tense. So this is not a prediction about the future that Jesus somehow got wrong, which it's often been misunderstood that way. This is Jesus telling them, some of y'all are going to get it. Some of you are going to see that God's kingdom has come and has come in power. Look again at the power of the life that Jesus lived. So 2 more times on the journey to Jerusalem, Jesus is going to predict his death. One is in chapter 9, verse 30. Time constraints won't let us dwell there. Let's turn to chapter 10. We're going to start in verse 32. They were on the road, on the way, going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them, and they were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. So we're on the cusp of the holy city now. We're getting really close. And right here, Jesus now tells them for the third time what is going to happen to him. That's the next few verses. Look at verse 35. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. And he said to them, what is it you want me to do for you? And they said to him, grant us to sit, one at your right hand, one at your left, in your glory. Really? You know how we've talked about having eyes to see and ears to hear? Boy, they don't right now, at least right now, do they? Jesus' response in verse 38. You don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism that I'm baptized with? Some of you likely know that Jesus will use the term cup in Gethsemane as a description of what lies ahead of him. You know, he says, let the cup pass. The baptism that he has empowered him to follow the way that he's going. So apparently, Jesus is telling them here that sitting at his right and left hands is reserved for those who follow him on this way. They really don't know what they're asking, do they? That goes on a little bit. Look down in verse 41. When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. The word anger here has an element of envy to it in Greek. And so the idea is they were actually mad that James and John beat them to the punch. Okay? And here's Jesus' response. So Jesus called them and said to them, you know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognized as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. Whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. As plainly as he can now, Jesus says that God's kingdom does not operate like Rome's with just different people leading the the program here. Jesus is not tweaking the current order to try to make it better. He's offering genuine renewal. So, not tyrants, but people who choose to serve one another. Think of the implications. If everyone is choosing to serve everyone else, then Rome's hierarchy is undone. There are no structures of domination and subordination in God's kingdom. Instead, there is welcome, mutuality, equality, and service among the beloved children of God. And now look at verse 45. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. I've noted several times, Jesus doesn't just teach, he does. So he came not to be served, but to serve. And as he does, he undoes Rome's hierarchy. We also saw that he ignored Rome's divide and conquer policy and ate with tax collectors and sinners and anybody else who wanted a place at his table. And all of that made him a great threat to Roman order. And so they're going to kill him. But note that he says he's giving his life as a ransom, which is what is paid to set a slave free. Now, I've not addressed to this point Jesus' announcement of his resurrection in these descriptions about what's coming. So let's do that now. You need to remember that this was a world where no one had ever experienced someone as resurrected before. Many Jews, though not all, but many Jews hoped for resurrection, but there was no experience of it. And most non-Jews didn't believe in life beyond the grave. In a world like that, Rome's threat of death weighed heavy on people. I mean, if this is all there is, you ought to try to stay alive as long as you can, right? And so the threat of death weighs heavy. And Rome could use it to get people to cooperate, which essentially meant they were cooperating with their own oppression. So another key to understanding Mark's sense of Jesus' death lies here. Because of Rome's power of death, and because of Jesus' faith in God as the God of life and God's promise of resurrection, Jesus gives his life to set them free from slavery to Rome's power of death. He came to serve, and he's going to do that. As promised, I know I'm running a little long here, hang with me. As promised, the journey to Jerusalem concludes with another story of a blind guy in chapter 10, verse 46. Jesus and his folks now are passing through Jericho, and they're on the cusp of the holy city, and Bartimaeus, a blind beggar by the roadside, hears the commotion and cries out to Jesus for mercy. The people shush him. This is a shame-honor culture. Bartimaeus has no right to call out to somebody like Jesus. And so they essentially tell him, in bald terms, to shut up. We should not be surprised that Jesus doesn't play by those rules. Look with me in verse 51. So Jesus calls Bartimaeus and says to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" That's the exact question he had asked James and John. They asked for the seats of honor when Jesus came in his glory. Bartimaeus' answer, "My teacher, let me see." Jesus going to grant this request? Sure he is. Verse 52, Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." And immediately he regained his sight and followed Jesus on the way. It's what disciples do. So that's the journey to Jerusalem, and Jesus is now about to enter the holy city, which is where we'll pick up next week. Okay? Pete, do we have questions that we need to address as we are finishing up?
Yes, we do. We have a question about what has sometimes been called the Messianic secret in Mark's gospel. Why do we see this behavior coming from Jesus that seems that he wants to conceal his true identity?
I don't know that. First of all, let me just say that I don't know that we can definitively say. Mark never explains those things. So let me say that right off the bat. So we're making educated guesses again. I'm not sure that it's so much Jesus is trying to conceal his true identity as much as he is wary of how people will understand those things. Let's go back to Peter using the term Messiah. The gospel begins, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus the Christ, or Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. So that's a true claim about Jesus. But if people understand it as somebody who's going to drive the Romans out, to someone who's going to choose violence and force, then they've misunderstood. And my guess is, and it's an educated guess, that the calls to not tell have more to do with that. I don't want people thinking this. I want them to hear what I'm saying, see what I'm doing, understand what the new life that God is giving us before they start sticking ideas into what I'm doing. My best guess about what Mark has. Okay?
Thank you. A second question is about the word ransom. What did ransom mean, maybe to Mark, and what were the nuances of it?
Ransom fundamentally means what is paid to set a slave free. And it would vary widely in that world. And so I'm not real sure what we want to know about nuances with that. What has happened in the New Testament, for example, is it gets used in a couple of different ways. Paul, for example, will use it with the idea of setting us free from sin. Jesus doesn't use that term. It's just ransom. And so in this case, my understanding of it would be that he is giving his life to set us free from whatever is enslaving us, whatever's enslaving his people. And so Mark doesn't use the term sin. In fact, that word actually occurs very little in Mark's gospel. But there are a number of things that have people in bondage in Mark's gospel. And Jesus' death will set them free from that. Good questions.
Yeah, very good question. This is a question for me, as I'm going to encourage others to put questions either in the chat or in the Q&A section. This emphasis upon seeing really makes me think of John's gospel. Do you think John had any sense, or whoever wrote John had any sense of Mark's gospel, or do you see similarities or differences between the emphasis on sight that's in both gospels?
I don't know that that John had seen Mark. Lots of the stories about Jesus, this was primarily an oral culture. And so the stories of Jesus were passed on and handed down orally even after the Gospels were written down. Because remember, this is a world without printing presses. And so even once there were Gospels that were written, most people aren't going to see them, and they sure aren't going to have opportunity to read them. And so the stories are passed on orally significantly into the I guess for a long, long time, actually, as this unfolds. So Mark and John, the authors of Mark and John, would have heard many of the same stories. I don't know that John, the author of John, would have read Mark. Maybe. It's not impossible, but I don't know that that's the case. I suspect they'd heard the same stories. And if, in fact, Jesus was teaching the importance of seeing, which I think I think that's probably pretty clear, that gets passed on to the communities that gives us Mark's gospel and the communities that gives us John's gospel. So the commonality there in both of those gospels is what Jesus was teaching and the importance of being able to see. And I love, again, the story of the second touch, that you can see clearly and you can see deeply, because appearances are deceiving. Okay?
Related question to that is, what in Jesus's teaching or in his life would help us to see in the way in which he would like us to see?
Okay, my response is all of it, which is not a helpful response. I think standing here right now and given what we just worked through, I think I would answer that question by calling us to recognize the kind of life that he was sharing, for one thing. I mean, the fact that the most common phrase leveled against him is he eats with tax collectors and sinners. And that's, that's big news in that world. I mean, it tells us that. So he eats with tax collectors and sinners. He welcomes everyone. He shares generosity, his compassion. It is a life that is very much outside what Rome was doing. And I think part of what we have to do in order to see as Jesus sees is to be willing to open ourselves to what is possible. To not get caught in the mindset that this is just the way things are, and nothing ever changes, so why bother? And the kind of that kind of perspective that this is the way the world works. We can't change the fact that the world operates this way. And Jesus is like, oh yeah, we can. Look at what's possible. And if we can have a mindset in terms of, I don't have to buy that this is just the way the world is. Mm-hmm. I can consider what's possible. To have that mindset is to open ourselves, I think, to being able to see the world and our lives in the world in new and renewing ways.
Great, thank you. The way things are is not the way things have to be.
That's exactly right. That's right. There's I don't know if some of you may remember the movie The Mission from a whole bunch of years ago. The very end of the movie, after a disaster has happened, there's a really mercenary kind of guy says to the papal representative, don't worry about it, the world is thus. And the papal representative says, no, thus have we made the world. Mm. And I always remember that. The world is not thus. We've made it this way. Which means we can unmake it as well. Good.
Yes. Good. Thank you, Dr. Minor. We're at the end of our time. We maybe another question just popped up. Somebody wanted to know if the sessions are archived. Yes, they are. In fact, they are on the MTS website under Sunday Morning Seminary. All of these sessions are recorded, and they usually appear on the Monday or Tuesday after each session. So you can review any of the previous ones and listen to this and watch this one again. All the Sunday Morning Seminary sessions are recorded as we go forward. So yes, you can access those on the Memphis Theological Seminary website at Sunday Morning Seminary, the tab. Also, you can encourage your friends and family, or even your enemies, register for the upcoming Sundays. We'll have one more Sunday with Dr. Minor next week, and then yours truly will take it on for a couple of weeks. Dr. Chris Davis to follow me, and Dr. Michael Turner will pick it up in August. So thanks to everybody. Thank you, Dr. Minor, and hope to see everybody back here next week at 9 a.m. Have a good Sunday and happy Father's Day.
Yeah, a happy Father's Day to all the dads out there. Good. Thanks.
Bye-bye.